Now we are going to our last presentation. Now we'll have the presentation by Adrian van Breda and John Pinkerton that will discuss the Global North and South dialogue in living care research. I will present them shortly. So Adrian van Breda is a professor of social work and the head of the Department of Social Work and Community Development at the University of Johannesburg. He studies resilience and care living, and is a principal investigator of a longitudinal study on care living in South Africa, now in its 8th year. He is the co-founder of the Africa Network of Care Living Researchers. John Pinkerton is a professor of child and family social work in Queen University, Belfast in Northern Ireland. He has a long-standing interest in young people living care, having undertaken a government-funded regional baseline study in the early 1990s. He also had interest in the development of developmental social work, prompted by his time as a member of the International Board of the Children Institute at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. In recent years, his collaboration with Adrian and involvement with SAYES, a Cape Town-based mentoring project for caregivers, has brought the two interests together and prompted him to think about the benefits and pitfalls of the cross-transfer of knowledge and experience between Global South and the Global North. So Adrian and John, please.
Thanks very much, Tehila. Afternoon, Johns. Good to see you again. Since INTRAC was set up in 2005, it's had this word international in its title. But really, it's only been recently that INTRAC has expanded beyond the global north, the sort of, minority world. And this imbalance between global north and south is reflected also in the body of published literature on leaving care, where we see a predominance of global north literature. However, the work that we've just heard now from Kwabena and Gertrude, and a little bit earlier from Rowan, have shown us that things are changing. And it's great that the important work of these Global South scholars is now being set alongside the research of a leading figure that I think we all respect from the Global North, like Mark Courtney. It seems like the Global South is coming to the party. But there are still important challenges to be addressed about how knowledge, research, and writing in our field are produced and regarded between North and South. And hopefully we can open up a bit of discussion about these challenges through reflecting on our two different vantage points, me in the South and you in the North, and also on our personal experience of working together across that divide. So John, can I put you a question just to get this dialogue started? In January this year, the journal Emerging Adulthood published a special edition on care leaving research in Africa. And you and I wrote an article that was titled, Raising African Voices in the Global Dialogue on Care Leaving. And I'd be interested to hear whether you think that Kwabena and I, as the editors of this issue, were right to give up an article space to address global dialogue, rather than to use it to share more African work.
Yes, I definitely do, because a special issue is an important addition of new African material to the international pool of understanding about care leaving. But I still think it's very important for us all to be open about the fact that what we know about the minority world of the global north still greatly outweighs what we know about the majority world of the global south. So just take, for example, the book edited by Philip Mendes and Pamela Snow a few years ago. It's a great book and was described by one reviewer as a truly international compendium. But if you actually look at it, 15 countries were covered in it, and only 4 of them are in the majority world. And I think we need to be conscious of that, and an important implication of that imbalance is I think we need to be very cautious about premature global generalization and over hasty commitment to terming something an international view on what the needs of care experienced young people are, and what constitutes best international policy and practice. In fact, given the present limited international understanding that we actually have, I think it's important we don't use that understanding as the benchmark against which to judge research coming from the global south. Rather, I think that research needs to be judged primarily on its own terms and then added to what we already know about care leaving in a way that encourages a two-way questioning about differences as well as similarities. It should be used to encourage a critical dialogue, if you like, because I'm convinced that to have a truly global understanding of care leaving, it's really important that as the international pool of care leaving research expands, as it has been doing over the last decade, material from the global south, the majority world, increases at a rate that offsets the present imbalance. Now, of course, that begs the question of how to do that. And so that's the question I want to pitch to you, Adrian. What do you think would help with resetting that balance, taking your majority world perspective?
Thanks, thanks, John. I want to stress that I think it's not just about the global south trying to catch up with the global north. I think that there's perhaps a more important issue about how we construct ethical ways of transferring knowledge between the global north and south. Decolonization, which is such a central topic in the world today, challenges how research findings and methodology that are forged in the north are seen as coming kind of from the center and needing to be disseminated out to the underdeveloped south, I suppose. Global north knowledge is, of course, a legitimate understanding, but it's also one that has been developed in particular times and places. So the ideas that come from the global north shouldn't be taken as truer or more valid or more important, more universal than ideas and practices that come from elsewhere, like the global south. Understandings of care leaving in the north are just as much situated and context bound, and can I use this word indigenous? They're just as much indigenous as understandings that come from Africa or South America. So thinking of northern knowledge as indigenous or provincial, I think is useful. It places a question mark over it for other times and places, and that enables it to be critiqued, to be reconstructed, and even discarded in response to other equally valid knowledge that's developed in other times and places. Of course, this does require that those of us who work in the global south need to do more research and better research. We have to work harder to develop the capacity to do that. The reality in Africa, as we've heard from Kwabena and also in fact from Rowan and Gertrude, is that the lack of funding and the limited research capacity means that most of the research that we do in the south is small. But we should also do more, I think, to strengthen the theoretical and methodological robustness of this small research. And we should pool resources and collaborate through networks like ANCHOR, as Kwabena mentioned, the African Network of Care Leaving Researchers. And I think in addition to that, we can collaborate better with our better resourced colleagues in the north. And that doesn't mean that we come holding out a begging bowl and asking for money necessarily, but it is about negotiating to mutual benefit. And like any negotiations, sometimes that's going to be uncomfortable, and sometimes we're going to have to make compromises. But we need more of these opportunities, and we do need to get better at making them happen and getting the most out of them. But John, this is not just about what researchers in the global south can do better. It's also a challenge to our colleagues in the global north like you, John. And so what do you think you need to do better and do more of?
Yeah, well, firstly, I have to say that I accept that this is very much a two-way street, an exchange, negotiation, as you put it. And given the power differential in favor of those of us in the minority world, I also think it right to acknowledge a particular responsibility on us to make a negotiated dialogue work. And that means a dialogue that promotes a global sensibility, not just about care leaving, but also about the wider cultural, political, economic assumptions, processes, structures that all go to make up the inequalities of contemporary globalization. Now that sounds grand, all very grand, but actually I think it just starts with us in the global north recognizing that there is care leaving experience from the global south that we need to know about. It is things to teach us, and not just about the global picture, but also about our own national contexts. And we need to find ways to relate to that experience in the global south. And clearly research collaboration is one way of doing that. And I agree with you, Adrian, that means negotiating to mutual benefit. I think it means negotiating the research questions, identifying what core concepts and theories are of mutual interest, agreeing ethical and equitable terms and conditions, not least the management of funding and of intellectual property rights and publishing rights. And given the funding and research infrastructure advantages of the global north, we need to be careful not to exploit those primarily in our own benefit. But taking account of leaving care in the majority world can and should, in my view, not just be about the collaborative research. So, for example, when we're reviewing literature for our own national research, I think we could work harder at seeking out material from the majority world, even though in these days of the internet, that can still be very challenging. So I think we need to support and benefit from resources like the annotated bibliography of African leaving care literature that the anchor website careleaving.com hosts. I also think we need to use whatever influence we have as journal editors and reviewers to ensure that more global south material is published in the global north. And that needs to be done not just through advice to authors, but also by rethinking editorial policy and practices. And just to go back to your point about provincializing our work, I think we do need to be more explicit about locating our own research in its national and global context. And in fact, I think that the national context should appear in the title or at least the abstract of all publications. And similarly, when citing others' research, authors should be explicit about where that research was conducted. I also think attention needs to be given to understanding the key organizing concepts being used to research and present findings from the global south. And I think once you start doing that, you begin to surface differences in the way in which meanings are being given to basic concepts such as family or out-of-home care. And it also begs interesting questions about relationship of terms such as social capital and Ubuntu, for example. Now, all of this, of course, I assumes coming across, clearly is going to take extra time and effort. And I think it's really important we do acknowledge the very real opportunity costs that go with trying to engage in the sort of globalizing work that we're talking about. So, Adrian, a last question for now from me to you is it worth the effort?
John, I'm sure I'm speaking for both of us when I say that our partnership, my partnership over these past several years has been really extremely enriching. It's enabled a wider and a deeper dialogue, not just between ourselves, but actually between our countries. You and I have visited with each other. We've spoken with and we've drawn in each other's research and practice partners, people like Bernie Kelly and Maya Chireni and others. You have very generously leveraged funding from the North for research on the South. And what that has done is enabled us to do the work that we want to do anyway, but just couldn't because of a lack of resources. And so that's enabled and strengthened our own agenda. You and I have also regularly checked into the power differentials between our two contexts. And I think that that's been very important. So for us in the South, this North-South dialogue that we're having, I think has been enormously beneficial. And so sometimes you'll find me using the word of challenging you to make the effort to engage in this dialogue. But perhaps really what we're actually trying to do is to invite you over to have a meal with us and to collaborate and participate in ongoing dialogue. So thank you, John. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adrian, for that invitation.
Okay, great. Thank you all for your great presentation and very interesting and inspiring ideas. And a few last question or more comment actually for John and Adrian. Just a second. There is a big question about how we cooperate more to expand the body of knowledge on care living in Global South, despite the attempt to make, the question is that the issue of care living is not such a public agenda and very interesting one in the Global South. So what should be done in order to make it more important, more relevant? What do you think about this?
Actually, if I can cut across, Adrian, jump in before Adrian. I did pose that question to Kwabena in terms of, does he think that having the UN guidelines mandate, which Emily reminded us of at the beginning, did that help get any traction with policymakers or indeed people like UNICEF? So I think that's an interesting question, whether having a global agenda like that, global mandate like that, can be helpful to us in some way or other. And the other point I would make is, it was interesting at Rowan's presentation, she clearly is addressing this issue of how to look at the media even. And I think in some ways that's ahead of us, or certainly not that different from some of the issues that we're grappling with in the North. So that VOIPIC, the Voice of Young People in Care in Northern Ireland, talked about trying to change the narrative and the need to engage with the media in a different way. So no easy answers, but I think it's on our agendas at the moment, internationally.
Adrian?
Yeah, I think also just, Kwabena mentioned or touched on this as well in his presentation, the sort of the lack of focus on children, or the focus on children in care, and not much attention to the children who've left care. And I think part of the reason for that is that in Africa, the needs and the vulnerability of young adults is so huge that why would we bother about this rather small group of young people who in some ways have been privileged or are seen to be privileged of having grown up in care, where they have, three meals a day, education, clothing, healthcare, a proper sort of roof over their head. And so it's quite hard in a sense to make the argument for this being a very vulnerable group. In some ways, care leavers in Africa do better than average, whereas in the global North, care leavers seem to do worse than average. And I think that the way that we're trying to argue that is to say, as I think John and others have done in the North, is to say, if we can figure out how to support this vulnerable group of young people in their transition to adulthood without the kinds of social capital and cultural capital that most young people have, then maybe we have cracked something that would help most other youth make that transition towards young adulthood. And so this becomes, in a sense, a case example of a particular vulnerable group of young adults that we need to work with.
Peer advocacy would be the other point, again, which Kwabena touched on, and there's certainly moves in South Africa for that here, and certainly the likes of Voice of Young People in Care here. The power of that Always important not to underestimate young people's own agency.
So last question, because we are running out of time, and I'm sorry for those of you who didn't get responses to your question. We will continue this discussion in privately. So since most of the journals are from the global north, the question is how do the global south researchers make their publication relevant to the journal and their leaderships? And I wonder if they should, but this is your question, so.
So how do we make our publications relevant to global north journals? Is that the question?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge that's always facing us who write in the South. And I think it's an interesting question. So I appreciate you ever asked it, because you're certainly not the first person, but I think it's curious that most journals are actually international. So Children and Youth Services Review, Families and Society, I mean, these might be based in specific countries, but the readership is international, global. And I don't think that this question gets asked of global north authors in the way that it gets asked of global south authors. I think the assumption is, and forgive me, I'm just going to be quite blunt now, is that if you are writing in the global north, and you happen to be in America or in England, and you write for your audience, that's fine. But if we're writing in the global south, then we have to somehow pitch why somebody in the north should bother to read this. It's taken for granted that we want to read global north literature, but not the other way around. And I guess that's the more sort of provocative side of the dialogue that John and I have been having over the last years, is to say, what is it about that power differential? And is it not possible just to read global south literature on its own merits, in the same kind of way that I read a lot of global north literature just on its own merits, not to say how is this relevant for me in South Africa, but just so that I understand what's happening in Germany or in Israel or America or somewhere else. I hope I haven't scared anybody away from the meeting.
Yeah. I mean, these are issues that well, in my view, they're sites of struggle, is the way I like to think about it, and they don't go away, they don't get neatly solved. And I noticed that Mark Courtney's made a suggestion that in terms of people who have experience in this area, maybe it'd be useful to pool that experience, and a number of people have run with that. Not least, I noticed that Neil Harrison is saying his journal he's involved with have explicit policies and procedures in relation to this, because I do think there's an individual author responsibility and ways in which individual authors can be given, supported, and that brings you then into questions of what is the editorial policy and procedures. So I think that's an interesting one that's been set running there, and it'd be nice to see maybe another special interest group come out in relation to that.
Great, so thank you very much for a very inspiring presentation and discussion. I'm sorry that we don't have enough time, because it seems that we can go on and on with this, but I hope that this session is only the beginning of a wider dialogue between the global north and the global south. So now